Welcome to HOA Citation Circus. I thought retirement meant quiet. I do not own a dog. I have never owned a dog. So when Susan Stewart from the Sunridge Meadows Association shoved a tiny sample kit bag in my face and told me the science does not lie, I thought she had lost her mind. She was standing on my driveway in a neon yellow windbreaker, waving a printed notice with a lab photo attached and demanding I pay $250 for failing to pick up after a pet I do not have. I work in IT support. I moved to Denver because I wanted a quiet neighborhood and a fresh start, and now I was staring at a compliance committee lead who looked ready to call the cops over dog waste that was not mine. Susan crossed her arms and said, "We have procedures for a reason." I told her there had been a mistake. She tapped the notice and said the vendor had matched the sample to my registration. I said I never registered a dog because I do not have one. She pulled out her phone, scrolled through a spreadsheet, and showed me a line with my address and a checkbox next to it. I leaned closer and saw my name, my unit number, and a column labeled Canine on file. The box was checked. I asked her when I supposedly registered. She said the portal showed I submitted the form 3 months ago. I told her I had not touched the portal in 6 months. She narrowed her eyes and said the science does not lie, and if I refused to pay, the board would schedule a hearing and refer the matter to collections. I took a breath and asked to see the lab report. She handed me a single page with a barcode, a sample number, and a sentence that said genetic match confirmed. There was no breakdown, no confidence interval, no chain of custody. I asked who ran the test. She said the HOA contracted with a company called Pet Trace Solutions, and that all residents with dogs were required to submit a cheek swab when they registered. I repeated that I never registered. She said the portal does not make mistakes and that I had until midnight to pay, or the fine would double. Then she turned and walked back to her golf cart, leaving me holding the notice and the tiny sample kit bag like evidence in a trial I did not sign up for. I went inside and read the notice 3 more times. It listed my address, a violation code, a date 2 weeks earlier, and a line that said sample collected on East Walking Path near Mailbox Cluster B. I had walked past that cluster plenty of times, but I had never stopped there with a dog. The notice included a grainy photo of a small brown pile on the grass and a close-up of the tiny sample kit bag with a label. The label had a number that matched the barcode on the lab report. I pulled up the HOA portal on my laptop and logged in. The home screen showed my account, my dues balance, and a tab for pet registration. I clicked it. The form was blank. No submission history, no confirmation email, nothing. I checked my spam folder in my trash. Still nothing. I called the management company and got a voicemail. I called the HOA hotline and got a recording that said to submit concerns in writing. I sent an email to Susan with the subject line "Urgent Registration Error" and attached screenshots of my blank portal. She replied in 4 minutes. Her message said the portal had logged my submission on the date in question, and that if I believed the vendor made an error I should request a retest at my own expense. She wrote that the board took pet waste seriously, because we live in a community where the board loves outsourced enforcement, and that refusal to comply would result in a hearing within 10 days. She signed off with "We have procedures for a reason." I grabbed my phone and texted my neighbor Marco. He is a vet tech at a clinic in Lakewood, and he had warned me about the HOA's new DNA program when I moved in. He texted back in seconds and said he would come over after his shift. I spent the rest of the morning searching for Pet Trace Solutions online. Their website was a single landing page with stock photos of happy dogs and a contact form. No staff bios, no lab address, no accreditation logos. I filled out the form and asked for a copy of my supposed registration and the full lab report. The auto reply said they would respond within 5 business days. Marco showed up at 6. I handed him the notice and the lab report. He skimmed them and shook his head. He said the report was garbage. He pointed to the line that said genetic match confirmed and told me a real forensic report would list the loci tested, the match probability, and the lab certification. He said Pet Trace was known in the vet community for cutting corners, and that their tests had a false positive rate nobody wanted to talk about. I asked him what I should do. He said I needed to get the vendor contract and see what the HOA actually agreed to, because if the contract did not require proper chain of custody or independent verification, the whole program was a scam. I filed a records request with the management company that night. The Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act gives owners the right to inspect contracts, so I cited the statute and asked for the Pet Trace agreement, the board resolution authorizing the program, and any correspondence about sample handling. The management company acknowledged the request and said they would provide the documents within 10 business days. I replied and said I needed them before the hearing. They did not respond. Susan sent another email the next morning. She said the board had reviewed my objection and scheduled a hearing for the following Thursday at 7 p.m. via Zoom. She wrote that I could present evidence but that the lab report was considered conclusive unless I provided proof of fraud or contamination. She attached a hearing notice with a link and a warning that failure to attend would result in a default fine of $500 plus administrative costs. She ended with "The science does not lie and we have procedures for a reason." I called Marco and told him about the hearing. He said he would testify if I needed him. I asked what he would say. He said he would explain that the test Pet Trace used was a basic mitochondrial panel that could not distinguish between dogs from the same maternal line, and that without proper controls the results were meaningless. He said if the HOA had registered multiple dogs with similar breeds, there was a decent chance the match was a coincidence. I thanked him and asked if he had any documentation. He said he had a journal article about canine DNA testing standards and a memo his clinic had sent to clients warning them about Pet Trace. He promised to send both. I spent the next 2 days digging. I walked to mailbox cluster B and looked for cameras. The HOA had installed a Ring doorbell on the cluster kiosk, but the angle was wrong and it only covered the front of the boxes. I asked the neighbors on the east path if they had seen anyone collecting samples. Most of them had no idea what I was talking about. One woman said she had seen a guy in a Pet Trace polo 2 weeks earlier walking with a plastic bin and a clipboard. She said he had knelt near the path, scooped something into a bag, and labeled it without gloves. I asked if she remembered what time. She said early morning, maybe 7. I thanked her and made a note. The management company finally sent the vendor contract on Wednesday afternoon, 1 day before the hearing. The PDF was 43 pages long and full of boilerplate, but I found what I needed in Section 12. The contract said Pet Trace would collect samples as needed, store them in a refrigerated locker, and ship them to a partner lab within 72 hours. There was no requirement for witnesses, no chain of custody form, and no clause about independent verification. The payment terms were a flat monthly fee plus a $50 bonus for every match. I read that line twice. The vendor got paid more when they found violations. I called Marco and read him the clause. He laughed and said that was a huge conflict of interest. I asked if it was enough to challenge the hearing. He said it was a start, but I needed something that proved the vendor had an incentive to cut corners. I told him about the neighbor who saw the collector working without gloves. He said that was contamination waiting to happen, and that if I could show the board that the vendor's procedures were sloppy, they might pause the program. I asked what else I needed. He said I needed to prove the match was wrong, and the only way to do that was to show that someone else's dog was the real source, or that the sample was mislabeled. I told him I had one more idea. I logged into the HOA portal again and went to the admin section. Most of it was locked, but there was a public directory that listed all registered pets by unit number. I scrolled through and found 18 dogs. 12 of them were listed as mixed breed or unknown, which meant their mitochondrial DNA could overlap. I took screenshots and saved them. Then I clicked on the registration tab and tried to view my submission history. The page loaded with an error message that said access denied. I refreshed and tried again. Same error. I opened the browser console and looked at the network traffic. There was a post request to a script called admin_override.php with my username and a timestamp 3 months earlier. The response was a JSON object that said status success. Someone with admin access had created a fake registration in my name. I took a screenshot of the console log and saved it. Then I checked the portal's audit trail. The HOA used a basic WordPress plugin for pet management, and the plugin kept a log of who edited what. I found the entry for my fake registration. It was timestamped 3 months ago at 9:42 in the morning, and the user field said, Susan S. I felt my chest tighten. Susan had added my name to the system before the test even happened. I printed the console screenshot, the audit log, and the vendor contract. I put them in a folder with the neighbor's statement and Marco's journal article. Then I wrote a 1-page summary that laid out the timeline. Susan had registered a dog in my name 3 months ago. PetTrace had collected a sample 2 weeks ago without proper procedures. The lab had matched the sample to my fake registration using a test that could not tell dogs apart. The vendor had a financial incentive to report matches. The whole thing was a setup, and I had the proof. The hearing started at 7 on Thursday. I joined the Zoom link and saw Susan in a neon yellow cardigan, the board president in a dress shirt, and 2 other board members in their living rooms. The president welcomed everyone and said the purpose of the hearing was to review my pet waste violation and determine appropriate penalties. He asked Susan to present the HOA's case. She unmuted and said the vendor had collected a sample on the East Path, submitted it for testing, and received a positive match to my registration. She held up the tiny sample kit bag and the lab report. She said the science does not lie and that the board's only job was to enforce the rules. She muted. The president asked if I wanted to respond. I unmuted and said I did. I shared my screen and opened the folder. I started with the vendor contract and read Section 12 aloud. I pointed out the $50 bonus and said the vendor had a financial incentive to find violations whether or not they were real. I showed the neighbor's statement about the collector working without gloves. I explained that without a proper chain of custody, the sample could have been contaminated or mislabeled. One of the board members interrupted and said the lab report was certified. I said the report listed no methodology, no confidence interval, and no independent review. I pulled up Marco's journal article and read the section about mitochondrial DNA limitations. I said the test PetTrace used could not distinguish between dogs from the same maternal line, and that with 18 registered dogs in the community, a false match was not only possible, but likely. Susan unmuted and said I was wasting everyone's time. She said the portal showed I had registered a dog and that the registration was proof of ownership. I nodded and said I was glad she brought that up. I closed the contract and opened the audit log screenshot. I zoomed in on the entry that showed her username and the timestamp. I said someone with admin access had created a fake registration in my name 3 months before the test, and that the log proved it was her. The Zoom chat exploded. One board member typed, "This is serious." Another typed, "We need to investigate." Susan's face went red. She said the log was a mistake, and that I must have registered and forgotten. I said the browser console showed a manual override script, not a user submission. I played the portal screen recording I had made that morning. It showed me logging in, clicking the registration tab, and getting the access denied error. Then it showed the console log with her username. The president muted everyone and said the board needed to caucus. The screen went black. I sat in my kitchen with my heart pounding. Marco texted and asked how it was going. I said I had just dropped the evidence and that Susan looked like she wanted to climb through the screen. He sent a thumbs up. The Zoom reconnected 5 minutes later. The president said the board had reviewed my evidence and determined that there were significant procedural concerns with the vendor program. He said the violation was dismissed and that the board would pause all DNA enforcement pending an independent audit. He said the management company would investigate the registration discrepancy and report back within 30 days. He thanked everyone and ended the meeting. If you are enjoying this story, please hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA nightmare content. Susan sent an email 10 minutes after the meeting ended. She said the board's decision was premature and that she would be filing a formal complaint with the management company about my unauthorized access to portal logs. I replied and copied the board president. I said the logs were part of the public record under Colorado law and that I had every right to review them. I attached the statute. She did not respond. The next morning, I got a call from the management company. The regional director said they had reviewed the vendor contract and the audit logs, and that they were terminating the agreement with PetTrace effective immediately. She said the board had voted to suspend the DNA program until they could find a vendor with proper accreditation and transparent procedures. She apologized for the inconvenience and said my account would be credited for any fees I had paid. I thanked her and asked about Susan. She paused and said the board was handling the personnel matter internally. I took that as a good sign. Marco stopped by that afternoon with a six-pack. He said he had heard from a friend on the board that Susan had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. He said the board had also received complaints from 3 other residents who claimed they had been hit with bogus violations, and that the management company was reviewing all PetTrace matches from the past 6 months. I asked if anyone else had been set up. He said he did not know, but that the vendor had reported 23 violations in 5 months, which was way higher than the national average for a community our size. He said it smelled like a quota system. I checked the HOA portal again that night. My fake registration was gone. The pet directory had been scrubbed, and there was a notice at the top of the page that said the DNA enforcement program is currently under review and all pending violations have been dismissed. I took a screenshot and saved it with the rest of my evidence folder. I also filed a complaint with the Colorado Division of Real Estate, which oversees HOA management companies. I attached the vendor contract, the audit log, and a signed statement from the neighbor who saw the collector working without gloves. The division acknowledged my complaint and said they would investigate. Susan avoided me for 2 weeks. Then one Saturday morning I saw her getting out of her car near the mailboxes. She was wearing the neon yellow windbreaker again, but she looked smaller somehow, like the fight had gone out of her. I walked over and said hello. She looked at me and said she was sorry. She said she had been under pressure from the board to show results, and that PetTrace had promised the DNA program would pay for itself within a year. She said she had registered a few owners without asking because she thought it would streamline the process, and that she never intended to frame anyone. I asked if she understood why that was a problem. She nodded and said she did now. She said the board had asked her to step down from the compliance committee, and that she was thinking about resigning altogether. I told her I appreciated the apology, and that I hoped she learned something. She said we have procedures for a reason. And then she caught herself and laughed in a sad, bitter way. She walked back to her car and drove off. The board held a special meeting in early November to discuss the vendor audit. I attended in person at the clubhouse. The president presented a report from an independent consultant who had reviewed the PetTrace contract, the lab procedures, and the sample chain of custody. The consultant found that PetTrace had no quality control protocols, no independent oversight, and no process for handling disputes. The lab they used was not accredited by any recognized authority, and the testing methodology was a basic mitochondrial panel that the consultant described as suitable for preliminary screening, but not for enforcement. The consultant recommended that the board terminate the program and refund all fees collected under it. The board voted unanimously to accept the recommendation. The president also announced that the management company had completed its internal investigation and determined that Susan had created unauthorized registrations for 11 residents, including me. He said the company had reported the matter to the state division and that Susan had submitted her resignation from the compliance committee. He said the board would not pursue further action against her, but that the HOA would be implementing new oversight procedures for all vendor programs going forward. He thanked me for bringing the issue to the board's attention and said my diligence had prevented further harm to the community. A couple of people clapped. I nodded and sat down. After the meeting, 3 other residents came up and thanked me. One of them said she had paid a $100 fine 2 months earlier because she thought she had no choice. Another said he had been planning to move because he could not afford the escalating fees. They all asked how I had figured it out. I told them I got lucky with the audit log and that I had help from Marco. I said the key was asking for the vendor contract and reading it carefully, because the contract always shows you where the system is broken. They nodded and asked if I was going to run for the board. I laughed and said I just wanted to live in peace. The management company sent a formal apology letter in mid-November. It included a check for $250 to cover the dismissed fine, plus an additional $100 for my time and trouble. The letter said they had revised their vendor approval process and that all future contracts would require board review, independent audits, and transparent dispute procedures. It also said they had updated the portal security to prevent unauthorized admin access, and that all pet registrations would now require email confirmation from the owner. I deposited the check and filed the letter with my evidence folder. Pet Trace Solutions went dark in December. Their website disappeared, and the contact form bounced back with a domain error. Marco heard from a colleague that the company had quietly folded after losing contracts with 3 other HOAs in the metro area. He said the owner had moved to Arizona and started a new business doing rental property inspections. I looked it up and found a LLC filing in Maricopa County with the same owner's name. Some people never change. The Colorado Division of Real Estate closed its investigation in January. They sent me a letter saying they had found that the management company had failed to provide adequate oversight of the vendor program, but that the company had taken corrective action and agreed to additional training for its staff. The division issued a warning and placed the company on a compliance watch list for 1 year. The letter said I could contact them again if I experienced further issues. I filed it and moved on. Susan moved out of Sunridge Meadows in February. I saw the for sale sign go up on a Tuesday morning. Marco said he had heard she took a job in Colorado Springs and wanted a fresh start. I did not blame her. The new compliance committee chair was a retired accountant named Bill, who sent a welcome email to all residents promising transparency and fairness. He said the board had adopted a new enforcement policy that required photographic evidence, written warnings, and a 30-day cure period before any fines. He said the goal was to build a community where the board loves outsourced enforcement less than it loves its neighbors. I appreciated the effort. I kept the tiny sample kit bag on my desk as a reminder. Every time I saw it, I thought about how close I came to paying a fine for something I did not do, and how easy it would have been to just give up and move on. I thought about the other residents who had paid without fighting back, and the ones who were probably still dealing with bogus violations in other communities. I thought about Susan and her belief that the science does not lie, and how that belief had blinded her to the system's flaws. Mostly I thought about how important it is to read the contract, ask the hard questions, and never assume that the people in charge know what they are doing. Marco and I stayed friends. He introduced me to a few people on his softball team, and I started playing in their spring league. One of the guys turned out to be a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. He said my case was a textbook example of how vendor incentives can corrupt enforcement, and he asked if he could use my story in a presentation he was giving at a community association conference. I said sure, as long as he changed the names. He sent me a copy of the slides a few weeks later. One of them had a bullet point that said always audit the auditors. I liked that. The board eventually hired a new vendor for pet waste enforcement, but they went with a local company that used visual patrols and warnings instead of DNA testing. The program was low-key and reasonable. I saw the patrol guy a few times on my walks and he always waved and moved on. No tiny sample kit bags, no lab reports, no midnight deadlines. It felt like a normal neighborhood again. I ran into the neighbor who had testified about the pet trace collector one afternoon at the grocery store. She asked how things had turned out. I told her the program had been shut down and that her statement had been a key piece of evidence. She smiled and said she was glad she could help. She said she had always thought the DNA thing was creepy and invasive, and that she was relieved the board had come to its senses. I agreed. She asked if I was still living in Sunridge Meadows. I said I was, and that I planned to stay for a while. She said good, because we needed people who were willing to stand up to nonsense. I thanked her and said I hoped there would not be any more nonsense to stand up to. She laughed and said in an HOA there is always something. The HOA sent out its annual report in March. It included a section on the vendor audit and the new enforcement policy. The report said the board had saved the community over $15,000 by terminating the pet trace contract, and that resident satisfaction scores had improved by 18%. It also said the board was committed to evidence-based decision-making and meaningful accountability. I read that line and thought about Susan and her spreadsheets and her certainty that the system was working. I wondered if she ever thought about the people she had hurt, or if she just moved on to the next job and the next set of procedures. I got a letter from the State Division in April. It was a follow-up survey asking about my experience with the complaint process. I filled it out and gave them high marks for responsiveness and thoroughness. I added a comment that said the division should consider requiring independent audits for all vendor programs, especially ones that involve fines or penalties. I did not expect them to act on it, but I figured it was worth saying. Marco called me in May and said he had heard that 2 other HOAs in the metro area had dropped their DNA programs after the pet trace story made the rounds. He said a reporter from a local news site had picked it up and written a piece about vendor accountability in community associations. The article quoted the consultant's report and included an interview with the board president. It also mentioned my name, which I was not thrilled about, but Marco said it was good publicity for the cause. I told him I was not looking to be a cause. He laughed and said too late. I kept the evidence folder in a filing cabinet in my home office. Every few months I would pull it out and flip through the documents, just to remind myself that the whole thing had been real. The vendor contract, the audit log, the console screenshot, the neighbor's statement, the tiny sample kit bag. It all felt like a weird fever dream, but it had happened, and I had proof. I thought about writing it up as a case study or a blog post, but I never got around to it. The story was enough on its own. The board election came around in June. Bill ran for re-election as compliance chair and won easily. The new board president was a software engineer who had moved in a year earlier. She sent an email introducing herself and promising to continue the transparency initiatives. She said the board would be holding quarterly town halls and publishing all vendor contracts on the HOA website. She said the goal was to rebuild trust and make sure residents felt heard. I replied and thanked her. I also volunteered to help with the website if she needed IT support. She said she would keep me in mind. Susan's house sold in July. The new owners were a young couple with a toddler and a golden retriever. I met them at the mailboxes one morning and welcomed them to the neighborhood. They said they had heard about the DNA program drama and asked if it was really as bad as people said. I laughed and said it was worse, but that the board had fixed it. They looked relieved. The husband said they had almost backed out of the sale when they saw the HOA had a pet waste enforcement program, but their realtor had assured them it was no longer active. I said the realtor was right and that the new board was much more reasonable. They thanked me and introduced their dog. His name was Cooper. I scratched his ears and said he was safe here. I still see the tiny sample kit bag on my desk every day. It is a strange trophy, but it reminds me that even the most absurd conflicts can be won if you are willing to dig through the paperwork and ask the right questions. It reminds me that systems are built by people, and people make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes turn into policy until someone pushes back. It reminds me that I live in a community where the board loves outsourced enforcement, but that I also live in a community where the board can be held accountable when that enforcement goes too far. Marco and I still grab beers every few weeks. He always asks if the HOA has come up with any new schemes. I tell him the board is boring now, which is exactly how I like it. He says boring is good, and that I should enjoy it while it lasts. I say I plan to. He raises his glass and says here is to boring HOAs and honest vendors. I clink my bottle against his and say I will drink to that. The whole experience taught me that the worst fights are the ones you do not see coming, and that the best defense is a good filing system. It taught me that people like Susan are not evil, just misguided, and that the real problem is the systems that reward bad behavior and punish questions. It taught me that allies matter, and that sometimes the person who saves you is a vet tech with a journal article and a healthy distrust of cheap lab reports. Most of all, it taught me that you do not have to own a dog to end up in a fight about dog waste, and that the science does not always tell the truth, especially when the science is paid to find violations. I still live in Sunridge Meadows. I still work in IT support. I still want a quiet neighborhood and a fresh start. The difference now is that I know what to look for when the HOA sends a notice, and I know how to fight back when the notice is wrong. I know that the tiny sample kit bag is not just evidence of a violation, it is evidence of a system that failed, and that the only way to fix a broken system is to shine a light on it and demand better. I know that I am not the only person who has been targeted by a bogus enforcement program, and that my story is just one of hundreds happening in HOAs across the country every day. I know that the fight is not over, but that this round went to the good guys, and that is enough for now. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.